The letter arrived on a Tuesday, dog-eared and travel-worn, smelling faintly of cedar and something floral that Roy Donovan could not quite name, and it was the two words buried in the third paragraph that stopped him cold and made him read the whole thing over again from the very beginning. Roy had been sitting at the long oak table in the kitchen of the Donovan Ranch, a spread of 2,000 acres just outside the town of Cassidy Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882. The morning sun was cutting gold bars through the window above the dry sink, and his coffee had gone cold beside his elbow while he worked through the correspondence that had come in on the stage from Santa Fe. There were 2 bills from the feed merchant, a notice about water rights from the territorial office, and then there was this letter, written in a cramped and careful hand by a woman named Mrs. Alma Pruitt of St. Louis, Missouri, who ran a respectable agency that connected eligible bachelors in the Western Territories with women of good character who were willing to make the journey west and build a life. Roy had written to Mrs. Pruitt in February, mostly because his foreman, a broad and cheerful man named Dale Sutton, had hounded him about it for the better part of a year. Roy was 32 years old, sober and steady, the owner of a working cattle ranch that produced enough to be comfortable if not extravagant, and he had been alone since his mother passed 4 years prior. The house was in good order because Roy kept it that way himself, but there was a particular kind of quiet in it that had started to feel less like peace and more like absence. He had not expected much from the letter. He had half expected to read a dry inventory of some woman's height and hair color and domestic accomplishments, the sort of catalog that made a man feel vaguely ashamed of the whole enterprise. Instead, Mrs. Pruitt had written something different. She had written about a young woman of 24 years named Helen Dugan, originally of Boston but more recently of a difficult situation in St. Louis that the letter did not describe in detail and Roy did not press for. Mrs. Pruitt described Helen as educated, capable of running a household, and in possession of a strong constitution suited to frontier life. She was handy with figures, comfortable with hard work, and had demonstrated an admirable resolve during a period of personal hardship. And then, tucked between a note about her fine needlework and a mention of her chestnut hair, Mrs. Pruitt had written the following line without apology or elaboration. She has been described by those who know her as willful and proud, and I feel it is my duty to be honest with you about that, as I find deception does no one any favors in these arrangements. Roy read that twice. He sat back in his chair and looked at the morning light on the floor and thought about willful and proud, and something that had been coiled tight in his chest for a long time without him knowing it started, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. He had grown up with a woman like that. His mother, Margaret Donovan, had been the kind of woman who could dress a wound and argue a land boundary dispute, and bake a perfect pie crust all in the same afternoon, and she had never once apologized for knowing her own mind. His father had loved her so fiercely, and so completely that Roy had grown up thinking that was simply how love worked. He had spent years half afraid it did not work that way for him, that he was perhaps the kind of man who would end up tolerating a woman rather than loving one, and the thought had made him postpone the whole business longer than he should have, but willful and proud. He went to the writing desk in the parlor and wrote back to Mrs. Pruitt that same afternoon. He told her he would like to proceed. He enclosed the agreed-upon sum for the agency's services and a separate amount for Miss Dugan's stage fare, and he wrote a brief additional letter addressed to Helen herself, informing her that he had received the recommendation and that he would be grateful for her consideration, and that the house had a good parlor and a kitchen with a proper stove, and that Cassidy Creek was a small town but a decent one. He mailed it before he could second-guess himself. Then he went back to work. Helen Dugan received Roy Donovan's letter on a gray morning in late March, sitting in the small back room of the boarding house on Clement Street, where she had been living for the past 7 months. The room was clean but narrow, with a window that looked onto the alley, and she had made it as presentable as she could with a pieced quilt she had sewn herself, and a small shelf of books that were among the few things she had kept from her life before. Her life before was a subject she did not dwell on, because dwelling on it accomplished nothing, and she had learned that lesson at considerable cost. She had come to St. Louis from Boston 2 years ago, following a situation that had seemed, at the time, like the beginning of something good. A man named Gerald Whitmore had convinced her that he intended to marry her, and she had believed him, and she had given up her position as a school teacher in Boston and traveled with his family party to St. Louis, only to discover on arrival that Gerald had a wife already, a fact his family had known and had kept from her with remarkable composure. The dissolution of that understanding had left Helen without references, without income, and without the particular confidence that comes from having one's trust rewarded. She had found work as a seamstress and later as a bookkeeper for a dry goods store, and she had rebuilt herself quietly and without complaint. And when Mrs. Prewitt at the agency had suggested that a fresh start in the Western Territories might suit a woman of her temperament, she had agreed without much deliberation. She was not romantic about it. She had been romantic once and knew how that ended. She read Roy Donovan's letter with the careful attention she gave to all correspondence, looking for evidence of dishonesty the way one looks for rot in timber. The handwriting was plain and even. The sentences were direct. He mentioned the stove twice, which she found oddly charming, and he said the town was decent without claiming it was anything more than that. He did not describe himself in flattering terms. He did not make promises that exceeded the facts of the arrangement. Helen put the letter down and looked out the gray window for a long moment. Then she wrote back and said she would come. The journey from St. Louis to New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1882 was not a romantic undertaking by any stretch. Helen traveled by rail as far as Albuquerque, which took the better part of 4 days through country that changed so dramatically and so continuously that she spent most of the journey with her face turned to the window, watching the flat green of Missouri give way to the golden plains of Kansas, and then to the high red country of the territory, where the sky was so large it seemed to press down on everything beneath it. She had brought 2 trunk cases and a smaller bag she kept close, which contained her books and her sewing kit, and a photograph of her mother that she kept wrapped in a piece of flannel. From Albuquerque, she took the stage south and west to Cassidy Creek, which was a journey of another day and a half over roads that deserved a more generous description than they received. The stage rocked and jolted, and the dust came through the window in soft, persistent clouds that coated everything, and the 2 other passengers, a cattle buyer and a minister, slept through most of it while Helen sat upright and watched the country and tried to decide what she thought of it. What she thought of it, eventually, was that it was remarkable. Not beautiful in any way she had words for, not green and ordered like the East, but remarkable in the way of things that are entirely themselves. The mesas stood like proclamations against the sky. The light was different here, cleaner and harder and more honest, and she found herself straightening in her seat as though it required something of her. Roy was waiting at the stage stop when she arrived. He had told himself he would simply stand and wait and let the situation unfold without making it into anything more than what it was. This was an arrangement made through an agency, not a courtship. They were strangers and would need to establish themselves as people before they could be anything else, and he was prepared to be patient and reasonable about the whole matter. Then the stage door opened and Helen Dugan climbed down, and Roy Donovan forgot every sensible thought he had prepared. She was not what he had imagined, and she was entirely what he had not known he was imagining. She was of medium height, with chestnut hair that had escaped its pins during the long journey and was curling in loose strands around her face, and her dress was travel-dusty but well-made, and she had a quality of standing that he could not quite articulate, a particular straightness, as though she had decided not to arrive tired even if she was. Her eyes, when she found him in the small crowd at the stage stop, were a warm and serious brown, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they have not yet made up their mind about, openly and without pretending to have reached a conclusion. He lifted his hat. She said, "Mr. Donovan." He said, "Miss Dugan, welcome to Cassidy Creek." There was a brief pause in which they regarded each other with the peculiar frankness of two people who have agreed to a significant thing and are now seeing if the reality matches the agreement. Then she said, "You mentioned the stove in your letter." He was caught off guard enough to smile. "I did. I would like to see it," she said, "after I have washed the dust off my face." He laughed then, a real laugh, not a polite one, and something shifted in the space between them, not into warmth exactly, but into something that had the potential for warmth, and that was enough for a beginning. Cassidy Creek was a working town rather than a thriving one. It had a main street of packed dirt that turned to mud in the rain and to powdered iron in the heat, lined with the essential establishments of frontier commerce. A general store run by a man named Hargrove who knew the price of everything and the value of most things. A saloon called the Red Ace that Roy seldom visited. A small bank. A post office. A livery. And a church of the Methodist variety whose minister, a man named Reverend Alcott, was a genuine and decent human being who asked for little and offered much. There was a doctor whose name was Crawford and who had hands that shook slightly at rest and steadied completely when he was working, which Roy found both alarming and reassuring in equal measure. There were perhaps 200 souls in the town itself, and another 300 or 400 scattered across the surrounding ranches and homesteads. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of a mail-order bride at the Donovan Ranch was the subject of considerable interest, discussed with varying degrees of goodwill over the counters and in the doorways of Cassidy Creek's commercial establishments. Roy had not sought to manage anyone's opinion on the matter. He simply brought Helen to the ranch, showed her the house, and told her that the arrangement was hers to define and that she should take whatever time she needed. The house was a good solid structure of adobe and timber, with thick walls that kept it cool in summer and tolerably warm in winter. The parlor was plain but not uncomfortable. The kitchen was large and faced east for the morning light, and the stove that Roy had mentioned twice in his letter was a fine cast-iron range that heated evenly and drew well. Helen stood in front of it and ran her hand along the top of it with an expression of what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "You have good taste in stoves," she said. "My mother picked it out," he said. "She had opinions." "I can see that." She turned to look at him. "Mrs. Pruitt told me about your mother, that she passed some years ago." "For years," he said. "She was a remarkable woman." Mrs. Pruitt said the same. There was a pause. "I am sorry for your loss." The words were simple, and she said them simply, without the elaborate sympathy that sometimes felt like a performance, and Roy found that he believed them. Helen slept in the room that had been his mother's, which he had prepared with fresh linens and a small bunch of dried desert flowers in a tin cup on the windowsill, because he had not known what else to do, and it had seemed insufficient to do nothing at all. In the morning he found her already in the kitchen, the fire lit in the range and coffee on, and she was standing at the window with her cup looking out at the country with an expression he would come to know as her thinking face. He said good morning, and she said good morning, and he poured his coffee, and they stood for a moment in the easy silence of two people who have not yet established a pattern but are willing to try. "What do you need from me to run this house?" she asked. "It does not need much running," he said. "I have managed well enough." "You have managed," she agreed, looking at the clean but somewhat Spartan kitchen with a mild and observant eye. "That is different from running." He conceded the point. She spent the first week learning the house and the ranch with the systematic attention of someone who had decided to understand a thing fully before offering any opinion of it. She walked the property with him on the second morning, asking clear and sometimes unexpected questions about the water supply and the soil and the age of the fencing, and the capacity of the root cellar. She made notes in a small notebook with a pencil she kept tucked into the pocket of her apron. She introduced herself to Dale Sutton with a directness that made the foreman blink and then grin broadly at Roy behind her back. She went into Cassidy Creek on the fourth day, walking the 1.5 miles without asking for the wagon because the morning was cool, and she said she wanted to see the road, and she came back having established herself at the general store and the post office, and apparently at the doctor's office as well, where Crawford had told her about the medicinal herbs that grew in the hills behind the church, and she had found this interesting. She did not talk much about Boston. She did not talk much about St. Louis at all. But on the 6th evening, when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the sun pull the color out of the sky in long spectacular sweeps of orange and deep red, she said, without particular preamble, "I want you to know that I came here in good faith." Roy, who had been watching a hawk work a thermal above the eastern ridge, said, "I know that. I have been in a situation before where good faith was not reciprocated," she said. "I am not accusing you of anything. I only want you to know that I know the difference now." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Mrs. Prewitt's letter mentioned your willfulness and your pride," he said. She looked at him with a directness that was not quite challenge but contained the possibility of one. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said. "It was why I wrote back." She considered this. The hawk made one long banking turn and disappeared behind the ridge. "My pride was used against me once," she said. "A man decided that because I thought well of myself I would be easier to manage. He was wrong about that. I imagine he was." "Are you the kind of man who needs to manage a woman?" Roy looked out at the evening sky and thought about his answer with the same care he gave to all important questions. "No," he said. "I am the kind of man who would rather have a partner than a servant." She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "That is a good answer," and went back inside to finish the dishes, and Roy sat on the porch in the dark for a while longer, thinking that the word willful had not yet done her justice. The weeks settled into a pattern that suited them both better than either of them would have admitted out loud. Helen ran the household with a quiet efficiency that had an invisible backbone to it, the kind of management that made things function smoothly not because anyone was forced to comply, but because the logic of the system was apparent and sensible. She reorganized the root cellar, improved the kitchen garden that had been neglected since Roy's mother died, established a system for the correspondence that Roy had been managing poorly, and began keeping the ranch accounts in a ledger of her own devising that was considerably clearer than the one it replaced. Roy watched all of this with a feeling he did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite admiration, though that was part of it. It was something more like recognition, the feeling of seeing something that was true. He was not a man who spoke freely about interior things, and Helen did not push him to, which he found he appreciated. They talked about the ranch, and the weather, and the news that came in from Santa Fe and Albuquerque. They talked about books sometimes, because Helen had brought a small library west with her, and he had a shelf of his own that had grown dusty in recent years. And they discovered a shared enthusiasm for history that surprised them both and led to long evening conversations at the kitchen table that extended past the point of utility and into the territory of pleasure, without either of them remarking on this directly. She was funny, which he had not expected, and which delighted him in a way he had to work to conceal. Not funny in a performance sense, not making jokes for effect, but possessed of a dry and observational wit that came out in small, precise comments that made him want to laugh, and then catch himself in surprise at having wanted to. One evening in May, Dale Sutton came to supper, which was a regular occurrence, and over the meal began to tell a long and self-aggrandizing story about a horse he had once broken on a ranch in Arizona, embellishing freely with each glass of water. Helen listened with perfect attentiveness until the conclusion of the story, and then said, in a tone of complete sincerity, "That is remarkable, Mr. Sutton. I did not know horses could count to 3. Dale stared at her. Roy pressed his lips together. "I never said the horse could count," Dale said. "No," Helen agreed. "And yet your story required it at two separate points." Dale looked at Roy. Roy looked at his plate. Dale laughed so suddenly and so completely that he nearly knocked over his cup. "I like her," Dale said to Roy, gesturing with his fork. "I am right here," Helen said pleasantly. "I know," Dale said, still grinning. "I said it for your benefit." Roy looked up from his plate then and met Helen's eyes across the table, and there was something there, something warm and quick and mutual, that lasted only a second before they both looked away. But it was there, and after that neither of them pretended, even to themselves, that this was still purely a practical arrangement. But neither of them said anything about it, because they were both people who had been careful with themselves for a long time, and the habit of care does not dissolve overnight just because the situation has changed. The trouble with the Caldwell brothers arrived in June, which was not a surprise to anyone in the Cassidy Creek area who had been paying attention. There were three of them, Birch, Lynn, and a younger one called Rafe, and they ran cattle on a stretch of land north of town that they held by virtue of a land claim of doubtful integrity. And they supplemented this income with activities that were politely described in town as questionable, and less politely described by Roy to Dale as theft conducted at low volume. They had been encroaching on the eastern boundary of the Donovan ranch for the better part of a year, moving fence posts and grazing their cattle into Roy's grass, and Roy had addressed the matter twice through the appropriate channels, once with the Territorial Land Office and once in person with Birch Caldwell himself, and both times it had resolved nothing and cost him time. In June, the matter escalated. Two of Roy's hands found a stretch of new fence 100 yards inside Roy's eastern boundary, clearly placed there in the night, incorporating what amounted to a quarter section of good grazing land. Roy went to see the county sheriff, a man named Holt Brewer who was honest enough but stretched thin across a territory that needed three of him, and Brewer came out and surveyed the situation and said he would write to the land office and that it would likely take some weeks to sort out. Helen, who had been listening to this account at the kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her, said, "Do you have the original survey documents?" Roy looked at her. "The survey from when the land grant was issued," she said. "The original paper survey with the boundary descriptions, not just the recorded version but the original." He had not thought of this. The original documents were in a tin box under the floor of the parlor, where his father had kept all the important papers, and Roy found them after 20 minutes of searching and brought them to the table where Helen opened them with careful hands and read through them with the same focused attention she brought to the ranch accounts. She found in the original surveyor's description a set of landmark references that were specific enough to be definitive, references to a particular rock formation, and a dry creek bed that had fixed names in the territorial records, and that placed the boundary precisely where Roy maintained it was, and precisely where the Caldwell's new fence was not. She made a clean copy of the relevant passages in her clear bookkeeper's hand, annotated the key landmarks, and wrote a brief cover letter addressed to the Territorial Land Office that was the most efficiently composed legal-adjacent document Roy had ever read, direct and precise and impossible to misunderstand. Roy read it through twice and looked at her. "You did not have to do that," he said. "No," she said, "but it needed doing." He filed the documents with the land office the following week, and the matter resolved itself in Roy's favor within the month, which was faster than anyone had expected, and which Dale Sutton attributed entirely to the clarity of the documentation. The Caldwell brothers were not pleased. Birch came into Cassidy Creek on a Tuesday in late June and made some remarks at the Red Ace about women who put their noses into men's business, and these remarks were reported back to Roy by the barber, whose shop was next door and whose walls were thin, and Roy went to see Birch at the saloon that same afternoon. He was not a man who sought confrontation, but he was also not a man who permitted certain kinds of talk to go unanswered, And the conversation he had with Birch Caldwell in the doorway of the Red Ace was brief and unambiguous. He told Birch that the land matter was settled by the law, that he had no further interest in a dispute, and that remarks about members of his household would be treated as remarks about himself personally. He said this last part quietly and without theatrical emphasis, which made it land heavier than if he had raised his voice. Birch looked at him for a long moment and then looked away and said nothing, which was, for the Caldwell brothers, as close to an apology as anyone ever received. Roy came home that evening and told Helen about it plainly and without dramatization. She was quiet for a moment. "You did not have to do that either," she said. "No," he said, "but it needed doing." She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, something complicated moving behind her eyes, and he noticed that her hands, which had been folded on the table, tightened briefly and then relaxed. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had looked at him with something that was unmistakably warmth without any reserve in it, and he felt it the way a man feels the first warm day after a long winter, with a kind of startled gratitude. July came in fierce and dry, as July in New Mexico territory always did, and with it came a heat that settled over the ranch like something physical, pressing the color out of the landscape and slowing everything to its essential pace. Helen had adapted to the climate with a practical flexibility that Roy admired, discarding certain East Coast notions about what was appropriate and adopting the territory's own logic about staying cool and conserving water, and not fighting the heat but working with it. She had also, over the months since her arrival, established herself in Cassidy Creek with a thoroughness that was entirely her own doing, and that Roy watched with a feeling somewhere between admiration and wonder. She had begun keeping accounts for 2 other businesses in town, Hargrove at the general store, and a widow named Mrs. Castillo who ran a small bakery, because Helen's facility with figures was impossible to hide, and people had begun to ask for her help. She had organized a lending arrangement among the women of the town for the few books that circulated through the community, and she had, with the assistance of Reverend Alcott, started a small school twice a week in the back of the church for the children of the ranching families, because the nearest proper schoolhouse was 15 miles away and open only in winter. Roy found out about the school when he was in town for supplies, and Reverend Alcott mentioned it with an expression of sincere appreciation. "Miss Dugan is a natural teacher," the Reverend said. "The children listen to her. She has a gift for making things plain without making them small." Roy said, "I know," and then realized how much certainty was in those 2 words and modified it to, "I have noticed that she is very clear." The Reverend smiled at him with a knowingness that Roy found mildly irritating and deeply accurate. He thought about it on the drive home, the wagon rocking under him and the afternoon heat bearing down, and he turned the whole situation over in his mind the way he turned land in the spring, looking at what was underneath. He had been honest with himself about the direction of his feelings for some time now. He had known since somewhere around the conversation on the porch in April that this was no longer an arrangement of convenience, that it had moved past that marker quietly and without ceremony, and that he was in the position of a man who has fallen in love with someone who he is not sure has fallen in love with him. The uncertainty was not comfortable, but he had lived with uncomfortable things before. What he did not know and could not quite work out was where Helen stood. She was warm with him now in ways that she had not been in the beginning. She laughed with him easily. She sought his opinion on things, not as a formality but with a genuine interest in his view. She had taken to leaving a cup of coffee on the writing desk when he was working in the evenings, set down without comment, just the cup, and he found this small habit more meaningful than he could have explained. But she had also been hurt before by a man who had used her trust, and she was careful with herself in the specific way of someone who has learned that carelessness is costly, and he did not want to press her, and could not tell where the line was between giving her time and waiting so long that the moment passed. He brought home a small thing from Hargrove's store that afternoon without particularly planning to. A bar of the good soap that he had seen her notice once when they were in town together. The kind with lavender in it that was imported from back east, and that Hargrove stocked in limited quantity because it was a luxury. It was a small thing. He left it on the kitchen windowsill when she was out in the garden. When she came in and saw it, she was quiet for a moment, and then she turned and looked at him with an expression of such unguarded softness that he felt his breath catch. "Roy," she said, just his name, but the way she said it had everything in it. "Hargrove had it in stock," he said, which was true and also entirely inadequate. She looked at him for another moment, and then she picked up the soap and held it in both hands and smiled, and it was the most completely happy he had seen her since her arrival, and he thought that his heart was not going to survive this in any recognizable form. August brought the summer storms, which arrived in the afternoons with a drama that Helen had not anticipated, and that she came to love with an intensity that surprised her. They swept in from the south and west in great gray-purple walls that darkened the sky in 20 minutes, and then broke open in sheets of rain and rolled thunder that made the ground vibrate beneath her feet. She would stand on the porch and watch them come, and Roy would stand beside her, and they would not always talk, but they were always together for the storms. It was during one of these storms, on an afternoon in the middle of August, that Helen told him about Gerald Whitmore. She did not tell it dramatically. She told it the way she told most important things, directly and without embellishment, and Roy listened without interruption, which was how he always listened. She told him about Boston and the teaching position, and the journey to St. Louis and the discovery of the wife, and she told him what it had cost her, not just materially, but in terms of the specific kind of self-trust that gets damaged when someone you believed in chooses to deceive you in a fundamental way. The storm came down in full outside, the rain slamming the porch roof and the lightning splitting the distance in white blades, and Roy sat beside her on the porch bench and listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "He was a fool." She looked at him. "Not just in the obvious sense," he said. "He had you and he chose deception over honesty with you. That is a particular kind of foolishness." She was quiet for a moment. "I trusted him because I thought I was a good judge of character," she said, "and then I found out I was not." "Or you were a good judge of character," he said, "and he was a better liar than you had any reason to anticipate. Those are not the same thing." She looked at him steadily. "You mean that?" "Yes." She turned back to the storm and they sat in silence for a while with the rain sheeting down in front of them and the air clean and electric, and then she said, quietly and in a voice that had something new in it, "I am glad Mrs. Prewitt wrote to you about me." "So am I," he said. She reached across the bench and took his hand, without looking at him, just her hand finding his in the stormlight, and he held it. And they sat like that until the rain eased and the thunder moved east, and the evening came in clean and cool behind the storm. Neither of them said anything else about it that night. But when she went inside, she gave his hand a single deliberate press before she let go, and Roy sat on the porch in the wet evening air, and thought that a man could live a long time on a feeling like that. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday morning in September, which was not a planned occasion, but came out of a moment that was entirely ordinary and therefore entirely right. They had been walking the eastern fence line together, which was a task Roy often did on Sundays with no particular urgency, and Helen had come along because the morning was beautiful, and she had been wanting to see the rock formation in the southeast corner of the property, the one that had been mentioned in the original survey documents, and she had never gotten around to it. They found it in the mid-morning, a low shelf of red sandstone that caught the sun at an angle and glowed like something interior-lit, and Helen stood in front of it for a long time just looking. Roy watched her looking at it and felt everything he had been carrying since April rise up in him at once and with such clarity that not saying it seemed more dishonest than saying it. "Helen," he said. She turned, and whatever was in his face made her expression go still and serious and open. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time, and I have been trying to be careful about it because I did not want to press you, and because I know you came here in good faith, and I did not want you to feel obligated to anything beyond the agreement. But I cannot keep it to myself anymore, and I think it would be dishonest to try." He stopped. "I would like to marry you. Not because it is the arrangement, but because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I want to spend my life with you. But if you do not feel the same, I will not make it strange between us, and I will honor whatever you decide." He had not made a speech like that in his life, and the exposure of it made him feel as though he had walked out into the open with no cover, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to and which he bore as steadily as he could. Helen looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright. "Roy Donovan," she said, "I have been in love with you since you stood up to Birch Caldwell and then came home and said nothing about it except that it needed doing." He stared at her. "And possibly before that," she added, with the hint of the smile he loved, "but that was when I was certain." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and she met him halfway, and he took her face in his hands and kissed her in the light of the red sandstone and the September morning and the whole wide New Mexico sky. And she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back with a thoroughness and a warmth that left no room for doubt on either side. When they broke apart, she was smiling at him with her whole face, not the careful, measured smile she had worn when she arrived, but something unguarded and brilliant and completely hers. "Yes," she said, in case he had forgotten the question. He laughed and she laughed, and they stood in the late morning sun by the red sandstone, and the joy of it was so simple and so complete that Roy thought it was the best moment of his life, and he was right. They were married at the Cassidy Creek Methodist Church on the 15th of October, 1882, on a morning that was so perfectly clear and blue it seemed designed for the purpose. Reverend Alcott performed the ceremony with a warmth and brevity that suited both of them. Dale Sutton stood up for Roy with an expression of profound satisfaction that he made no attempt to moderate. The church was attended by nearly everyone in town, because Helen had become, in her 7 months in Cassidy Creek, a genuine part of the community, not as an extension of Roy Donovan's household but as herself. Helen Dugan, who kept the accounts and ran the book lending and taught the children twice a week, and could be relied upon to give you a straight answer if you asked her a straight question. Helen wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with a small lace collar that had been her mother's, and she walked down the short aisle of the church with a composure that was entirely characteristic of her and eyes that were entirely for Roy. And when he saw her, he thought with a sudden and helpless clarity that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, not just in the way of the dress and the morning light, but in the way of everything she was. When Reverend Alcott asked if anyone present had cause why these two should not be wed, there was a moment of silence, and then Dale Sutton said, loudly and cheerfully, "No cause at all, Reverend. Get on with it," which drew a laugh from the congregation and a smile from Helen that Roy wanted to carry with him for the rest of his life. He said his vows in a steady voice and meant every word of them with the totality of his whole person. Helen said hers looking directly at him, clearly and without hesitation, and when she said the word husband she said it as though she had decided what it meant and was entirely satisfied with her definition. The reception was held in the street outside the church, because Mrs. Castillo had made a cake of extraordinary ambition, and the church was too small to contain both the cake and the people. And there was music from a fiddle player named Tomaz, who came up from a ranching family 10 miles south, and who played with an enthusiasm that compensated generously for any technical gaps. People danced in the dust of the main street of Cassidy Creek, while the afternoon sun made everything golden, and Roy danced with his wife, which was an extraordinary thing to think, his wife, and she danced well and laughed at him when he missed a step, and he didn't care in the least. Mrs. Castillo cried, which she had been doing on and off since the ceremony, and when Helen went to her and asked if she was all right, she said, "I am perfectly well, my dear. I am only happy for you," and then cried again. And Helen, who had kept her own composure throughout the day with characteristic determination, found her own eyes going suddenly bright and had to look up at the sky for a moment to recover herself. Roy saw this from across the street, this brief and private moment of his wife being quietly moved, and he thought that the word willful, which had started everything, was only the surface of her, the outer edge of something much deeper and much finer, and that he was the luckiest man in New Mexico territory, which in 1882 was saying something considerable. The first year of their marriage was a year of building, which was fitting in every sense of the word. They built the ranch into a stronger operation, with Helen's management of the accounts and Roy's work with the cattle and Dale's capable oversight of the hands, creating a system that functioned with a new efficiency and generated a modest profit in the fall cattle drive to Albuquerque. That was the best the Donovan ranch had seen in 6 years. They built the house into something more fully lived in, expanding the kitchen garden and adding a room onto the east side of the house that became a proper study and library where the books could be kept and where the accounts could be worked on in good light. They built each other, which was the most important thing and also the most private. Roy was a man who had been largely self-sufficient for 4 years and had developed certain habits of solitude that were not always easy to give up, not because he did not want to, but because the habit of keeping things inside oneself is one that loosens slowly and requires a particular kind of patience in the person who is waiting. Helen had that patience. She did not demand openness. She simply created the conditions for it, the evening conversations, the shared work, the consistent and unhurried attention she gave to everything he said. And over the months he found himself talking to her about things he had not previously put into words, about his father who had died when Roy was 22 and had left him the ranch as both a gift and an obligation, about the years of running it alone after his mother, about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by land and work and people, and still feeling like there was no one who knew you. She listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, full and honest and without judgment. And when she had something to say, she said it. And when she did not, she simply held the space for what he had said. And Roy thought that being known was a remarkable thing, that it was the thing he had not known he needed, and that had been missing without him having a name for it. He also discovered in the first year that Helen's willfulness was not a character flaw that needed management, but a function of her genuine and deep-rooted commitment to what was right, and that when she disagreed with him, which was not infrequent, she was usually correct, and that the conversations that followed a disagreement were among the most clarifying and productive he had ever had. They argued with words and with honesty and without cruelty, and they always came out the other side somewhere better than where they had started. And Roy thought that this too was what his parents had had, this particular architecture of a marriage that was built on respect as much as love, and that he had perhaps understood it when he was young, but had not believed it was available to him until now. Helen's pride, which Mrs. Pruitt had also documented faithfully, turned out to be a pride in work and in honesty rather than a pride in position or status, and in the territory where work and honesty were genuine currencies. This was not a liability but an asset of considerable worth. She was proud of the school and the students who came to it twice a week. She was proud of the accounts she kept and the accuracy of the figures and the clarity of the ledgers. She was proud of the ranch and what they were making of it together. She was proud of Roy, which he found both humbling and wonderful, and she showed it not by telling him so, though she told him sometimes, but by the way she spoke of him to others, with an ease and a certainty that suggested she had taken complete and confident possession of her opinion of him and had no interest in revising it. The second year brought rain in the spring, which was a mercy in the territory, and a particularly good calf crop, and the expansion of Helen's school into 3 days a week by popular demand. And one other significant development that Roy found out about on a March morning, when Helen came into the kitchen where he was having his coffee, and stood in the doorway with an expression that was trying hard to be composed and not quite succeeding. He looked at her. She said, "I believe we are going to need to consider the room on the east side of the house." He looked at her more carefully. "For the library," he said, because the books had been increasing steadily and he had thought she wanted more shelves. She gave him a look of such loving exasperation that he understood completely. He stood up so fast he knocked his coffee cup sideways. "Helen," he said. "Yes," she said, and now she was smiling with the brilliant, unguarded smile, the one he loved best. He crossed the kitchen and took her in his arms, and she let him hold her, which she sometimes did with a kind of ease that still surprised him, still made him feel the specific miracle of having gotten here from where he had been. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said, which was the same thing Mrs. Castillo had said at the wedding, and it made them both laugh. They told Dale Sutton at supper, and Dale went a remarkable shade of red with what was clearly suppressed emotion, before recovering himself and proposing a toast with his water cup. They told Reverend Alcott the following Sunday, and the Reverend looked at them both with a warmth that Roy had come to associate with the man's best quality, the ability to be genuinely glad for other people without any admixture of performance. They told Mrs. Castillo, who cried, predictably and magnificently, and who immediately began discussing what she would bake for the occasion, as though the occasion could not properly occur without the right pastry to mark it. Helen continued to run the school and keep the accounts and manage the household through the spring and into the summer with what Roy described to Dale as fearless practicality, and what Dale described as a certain stubbornness that he meant entirely as a compliment. She was not a woman who allowed a pregnancy to render her helpless, which was not to say she did not have days that were hard, because she did. And on those days Roy worked quietly around her and kept the coffee strong and did not make her talk if she did not want to. She was grateful for this without saying so directly, because she was not always direct about gratitude. She showed it in other ways, small and continuous and accumulating like deposits in an account, the way she leaned against him sometimes in the evenings, the way she reached for his hand first now rather than waiting for him to reach for hers, the way she said his name in the middle of ordinary conversations, as though she wanted to mark that it was him she was talking to and no one else. The summer of 1883 passed in heat and work, and the slow expansion of their life together. Roy made improvements to the water system, digging a better cistern and improving the channel from the spring in the hills, which was a project he had been meaning to do for 2 years, and that Helen's meticulous water usage records had finally made undeniably necessary. Helen trained a young woman from town named Pilar Castillo, Mrs. Castillo's niece, to help with the school and to take over if Helen needed time away. The cattle market was steady, and the hay crop was good, and the Caldwell brothers, who had been quiet since the land matter was settled, apparently determined to cause trouble in a different direction, and were cited by the territorial office in August for a separate boundary violation on property belonging to a homesteader family to the north, which Holt Brewer handled with a new efficiency that some attributed to the improved documentation that was now the standard in the area. The baby arrived on the 14th of October, exactly 1 year to the day after their wedding, which was a timing that no one had anticipated, but that, once established, seemed entirely appropriate. Dr. Crawford came out from town and delivered the baby with steady hands and calm competence, and Dale Sutton paced the yard outside the house in circles for 2 hours with an anxiety that Roy found both touching and somewhat distracting. It was a boy. Roy held him in the first minutes of his life, this entirely real and completely astonishing small person, and he had the thought that he had not expected the feeling to be this immediate, this particular recognition, as though the boy had always been what they were building toward, and he had simply not known it until now. He looked at Helen, who was exhausted and luminous in the way of women who have done the hardest work, and she was looking at him hold the baby with an expression that was too full to be described in any single word. "Hello," Roy said to the baby, which was not an eloquent greeting but seemed to cover the essential matter. "He needs a name," Helen said, in the voice of a woman who has thought about this already. "James," Roy said, "his father's name." Helen looked at him for a moment. "James Roy Donovan," she said, completing it. Roy nodded, not trusting his voice entirely. Dale was permitted in shortly after and greeted baby James with a solemnity that lasted approximately 30 seconds before dissolving into open delight. And he held the baby with the uncertain but earnest care of a man who had no children of his own and felt the weight of the occasion. Cassidy Creek greeted the arrival of James Donovan with the collective warmth of a community that had adopted Helen as its own and Roy as a man improved by her company, which was the general consensus in town, and one that Roy did not dispute. Mrs. Castillo baked a cake. Reverend Alcott came out to the ranch to say a blessing. Hargrove at the general store set aside a tin of the good imported soap, which he had started stocking regularly, for Helen's recovery period, with a note that said only from the store. "Congratulations." Helen kept the note. The years that followed were, in the truest and most meaningful sense, good years, and Roy would not have traded a single hard day of them for anything. They were hard sometimes, as all good things are. The winter of 1884 was brutal, with cold that arrived early and stayed late, and a blizzard in February that trapped them at the ranch for 11 days, and tested the water system and the hay supply and the tempers of everyone on the property. They managed it because they managed things together, and because Helen had the foresight in November, when Roy was thinking only as far as Christmas, to order additional supplies and stack additional wood, and because Roy had improved the insulation on the barn the previous fall when she suggested it, and because Dale Sutton was the kind of foreman who could improvise with remarkable creativity under pressure. They were hard because the territory was not an easy place, because the work was physical and unrelenting, and the weather was indifferent to human planning, and because there were always things that went wrong: a calf lost, a well running low, a piece of equipment failing at the worst possible time. These were the ordinary hardships of the life they had chosen, and they bore them the way people bear ordinary hardships when they bear them together, which is to say that they became simply the texture of the life rather than the meaning of it. The meaning of it was other things. The meaning of it was James, who grew from a solemn and observant infant into a talkative and adventurous toddler, who had his mother's direct brown eyes and his father's steady temperament, and an apparently inborn fascination with horses that began, according to Dale, at approximately 18 months, when he stopped crying every time a horse came near, and started reaching out his small hands toward them instead. The meaning of it was the evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, and the books open and Helen correcting the accounts while Roy read something aloud, an arrangement they had arrived at through habit, and that had become the structure of their piece. The meaning of it was the conversations that went on into the night sometimes, about the territory and the country, and the things that were changing and the things that were staying the same, because 1882 was becoming 1883 and then 1884, and the territory was not the same place it had been 10 years before, and would not be the same place it was now in 10 years more. They talked about this with the thoughtfulness it deserved, because the changes were not simple. The railroad was spreading its network across the territory, bringing commerce and people, and also bringing a certain kind of pressure that Roy watched carefully and with some unease. The land in the territory had been Apache land before it was anything else, and the restrictions that had been placed on the Apache people in the years preceding were a source of ongoing hardship and injustice that Roy and Helen did not look away from, even when looking at it was uncomfortable. There were Apache families whose land and movement had been curtailed by territorial policies that served the interests of settlement at the expense of people who had been here far longer. And this was a fact that sat uneasily in Roy's conscience, because his own land, the Donovan Ranch, had been granted under the same system that dispossessed others, and he knew it. He said this to Helen one evening, not as a confession but as a statement of something he had been working out. She was quiet for a moment. "Knowing it is the beginning of something," she said, "not the end." "What do you mean?" "I mean that a man who knows an injustice exists and sits with the discomfort of knowing it is better than a man who looks away," she said. "But the question is what you do with the knowing." They talked about this for a long time, about what was actually possible, and what was meaningful and what was merely gesture. And Roy thought that this was one of the things he loved most about her, that she would not let him be comfortable with a partial truth, but also would not let him be crushed by the limits of what was possible. She had a quality of practical moral clarity that cut through the fog of complicated situations and found the thing that could actually be done, and then she pushed for that thing without apology. What they did, over the following years, was modest but genuine. Roy worked to ensure fair labor arrangements for the workers who came through the ranch, which in the territory of the 1880s was not the standard, and which made a difference to the men who worked for him. Helen's school admitted every child regardless of background, which in a territory that was home to Mexican families and Anglo families, and the children of mixed heritage, was not a trivial commitment. When a family named Ray's, who had been farming a small homestead 15 miles east, ran into trouble with a claim jumper backed by money from Albuquerque, it was Helen who organized the documentation that Dale Sutton and Roy then delivered to the land office in Santa Fe in person, making the trip by horse in 2 days. And it was Helen who wrote the letter to the territorial newspaper that ran in December of 1884, and was clear-eyed and precise about what had been attempted and what had been done about it. The letter was published under the name H. Donovan, and some people in town assumed at first that Roy had written it, and when it emerged that Helen had, there was a range of responses from admiration to disapproval, and Helen treated both with the same equanimity she brought to most things, which was to say she noted them, and then continued doing what she was doing. Roy, when asked at the general store what he thought of his wife writing letters to the newspaper about land justice, said without hesitation that he thought she was right, and that the letter was accurate, and that if anyone had a counterargument they were welcome to write one. Nobody did. The spring of 1885 brought a second pregnancy, which Helen approached with the same practical steadiness as the first, but with somewhat less tolerance for people asking if she was certain she was not overdoing it. She told Dale Sutton, who asked this question on a Tuesday in March with genuine concern, that she had been overdoing things since she was 20 and had not experienced any negative consequences from it yet. Dale told Roy later that week that Helen was the most formidable woman he had ever met. Roy said, "I know," and meant it as the complete truth. The second baby arrived in November of 1885, and this time it came faster than the first and with less ceremony, as second children sometimes do, and it was a girl, which Helen greeted with an expression of quiet delight that Roy found extraordinarily moving. They named her Margaret for Roy's mother, and called her Maggie within the week because James, who was 2 years old and in full command of his own opinions, could not say Margaret clearly, and Maggie had a sound that suited the baby's particular quality of alertness and expression. Maggie arrived in the world with dark hair and Roy's gray eyes, and an apparent determination to make her presence known from the first moment, which she did with considerable vocal energy, and a grip that Dr. Crawford described as impressively strong for a newborn. James accepted her with the cautious and somewhat territorial interest of a 2-year-old who has not previously shared his universe with another person of his own age category. and after a period of adjustment that lasted approximately 2 weeks, during which he tested every boundary Helen had established with a thoroughness that she addressed consistently, and without escalating emotion, he arrived at a settled acceptance that over the following months developed into a genuine and protective tenderness. The house on the Donovan ranch, which had been built for one person and then modified for two, underwent a proper expansion in the winter of 1885 and into 1886, with Roy and two of the hands adding a proper second room at the back and extending the porch around the south side of the house. Helen had drawn the plans herself, with a clarity and spatial logic that the carpenter from town looked at and said was better than most plans he'd worked from professionally. The new room was light and well-proportioned and smelled of new timber for months afterward, and it became the room where the children slept, where Roy would stand in the doorway sometimes in the evenings and watch them in their beds and feel the kind of fullness that he had no words for and did not try to put into words. He told Helen once, lying awake in the night when the house was quiet and the stars were visible through the open window, that he had not known a life could hold this much. She was quiet for a moment, her hand finding his in the dark. "Neither did I," she said. "I had rather given up on it." "The willful and proud woman," he said. She laughed softly. "Is that still how you think of me?" "No," he said. "That is how Mrs. Prewitt thought of you. I think of you as the person I want to tell everything to." She was still for a moment, and then she moved closer to him in the dark and put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they lay in the quiet of the house with the children asleep in the next room and the stars indifferent and magnificent outside, and everything was exactly as it should be. Cassidy Creek itself was changing in these years, as the territory changed around it, and some of the change was good, and some of it was complicated. The railroad came within 20 miles of the town in 1886, which improved the cattle market considerably, and brought a new category of traveler and commercial opportunity, but also brought a faster pace of things that some of the older residents found uncomfortable, and that Roy watched with a careful attention. New people arrived, some of them good, and some of them the advance guard of a commercial interest that would eventually, he suspected, transform the territory beyond what he could currently imagine. He discussed this with Helen on one of their evening rides, which had become a habit in the good weather months, an hour on horseback in the late afternoon when the light was at its best and the heat had eased. Helen rode well, better than she had let on when she arrived, and on horseback she had a particular ease that suited the country, as though she had been made for this landscape even if she had not been born to it. She said, "Things change and we change with them, or we fight the change and lose anyway. The question is whether you shape the change or let it shape you, and how do you shape it?" She turned in her saddle to look at him, the evening light across her face, her hair loose under her hat. "You build something that matters and you protect what matters and you teach your children what is worth keeping," she said. "That is all anyone can do." He looked at her in the evening light of New Mexico and thought, as he thought regularly and with continuing surprise at the depth of it, that he was in love with her in a way that had only grown since he married her, that had deepened rather than settled into familiarity, that was more complete and more certain with each year that passed. "Helen," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "Thank you for coming," he said. "For getting on the stage and coming." She looked at him for a moment with the warm, direct, serious eyes that he knew better than he knew anything else in the world. "Thank you for reading the letter twice," she said. He laughed, and she laughed with him, and they rode back toward the ranch in the last light of the afternoon with the red country spread out around them and the house lit warm against the coming dark. The fall of 1886 brought the cattle drive that was the strongest in the Donovan Ranch's history. A clean 200 head to Albuquerque at a price that was better than the previous years, and that cleared the remainder of the ranch's outstanding debt and left a meaningful balance in the account for the first time in years. Roy came home from Albuquerque with this news and a small package he had found at a shop there, a collection of poetry that he had seen Helen look at in a catalog once and note, and then set aside because it was not a necessary expense. She unwrapped it at the kitchen table with James watching and Maggie asleep in her chair, and she ran her thumb across the cover and then looked up at him. "You remembered," she said. "You mentioned it last winter." "I mentioned it once," she said. "I know." He sat down across from her. "I remembered it." She looked at him in the way he had come to know, the fully open look that she gave to things that mattered, and then she said, "Roy Donovan, you are a very good man." He felt this in the way of things that are true, and that you know are true even when you cannot quite believe them. "I have a very good woman," he said. James, who was 3 years old and had been following the exchange with the close attention of a child who senses something important is happening without being able to articulate what, said with great seriousness, "Mama has a book." "Yes," Roy said with equal seriousness. "Mama has a book." Helen laughed, and the kitchen was full of it, the warm and specific sound of her laughing in the house, and Roy thought that there was no better sound in the world. Dale Sutton got married in the spring of 1887 to a woman named Clara who had come west from Colorado to visit her sister, and decided to stay when Dale presented her with an argument for staying that Roy later described as the most sustained act of persuasion he had ever witnessed from a man who was usually more comfortable with cattle than with words. Clara was a quiet woman with a dry humor that surfaced in unexpected moments, and a genuine warmth toward Helen that developed over the months into a real friendship, the kind that is built on the foundation of women who respect each other's intelligence and have no need to compete for anything. The Sutton house was half a mile down the road from the Donovan ranch, which meant that the children had each other, and the women had each other, and the men had each other, and the four of them developed a pattern of Sunday dinners that rotated between the two households and became one of the reliable pleasures of the year. James and Maggie grew with the astonishing speed of children who are in the right soil, which is to say that they were given safety and consistency, and the expectation that they would develop into capable and decent people, and they proceeded to do so. James was serious and curious, and had a gift for reading that appeared early and that Helen nurtured with a generous supply of books, and the consistent message that reading was not a luxury, but a fundamental tool of understanding the world. Maggie was as bold as her grip had suggested at birth, fearless about horses and weather and the outdoors in a way that delighted Roy, and kept Helen in a constant calibration between encouragement and caution. One evening in 1887, when Maggie was nearly 2 and had recently discovered that she could climb over the fence of the kitchen garden and showed no sign of considering this a problem, Helen came into the parlor where Roy was reading and said, without preamble, "Your daughter climbed out of the garden again." Roy looked up. "She is also your daughter." "When she is in the garden she is your daughter," Helen said, sitting down across from him with the expression of someone making a calm and reasonable argument. "When she is doing what she is supposed to be doing, she is our daughter." Roy put down his book. "That is not a logical system," he said. "It is an entirely logical system," she said. "I invented it and I find it very consistent." He looked at her. "Do you know what she reminds me of?" Helen raised an eyebrow, already suspecting. "A word in a letter," he said, "that made me read the whole thing twice." She was quiet for a moment, and then her face broke into the complete smile. "You are terrible," she said. "You are raising a second willful and proud person," he said, with the warmth of a man who considers this a magnificent outcome. Helen threw the nearest pillow at him, which he caught, and they argued the point until they were both laughing too much to argue any more. And Maggie, for her part, climbed back into the garden of her own accord and sat in the dirt looking at the bean plants with the profound satisfaction of someone who has made a point about independence and considers the matter settled. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, with the particular combination of routine and surprise that makes a life feel both stable and alive. The ranch continued to grow in a measured way, not dramatically but sustainably, with Helen's management of the accounts ensuring that the growth was real, and the decisions were grounded in actual figures rather than optimism. Roy added a third hand in 1888, a young man from a ranching family in the south of the territory named Eduardo Reyes, who was the nephew of the family Helen had helped in 1884, and who turned out to be a skilled and reliable worker who stayed with the Donovan ranch for years. The school that Helen ran had by 1888 grown to 30 students in 3 days a week and required a proper schoolroom, and the town of Cassidy Creek built one, in the practical Western manner, which is to say that about 40 people showed up on a Saturday in May and put it up in a day, with Helen directing the placement of the windows, because she had opinions about light and learning that she expressed clearly, and that the builder, after one conversation, simply accepted as correct. She taught there for years, and the students who passed through her school learned to read and to reckon, and to write clearly and to ask questions, and to think about what they were told with the same honest scrutiny she applied to everything. Some of them went on to things beyond Cassidy Creek, further education or businesses or positions of some responsibility, and some of them stayed and built what the town was building, and all of them carried something of her clarity with them. Roy watched this with a pride that was quiet and absolute. He had not built the school and he had not taught in it, and the credit for it was entirely hers, and he was proud of her in the way of someone who loves another person enough to be simply glad that they are what they are, without needing any portion of the credit. She knew this about him, and it was one of the things she loved most. In the evenings of 1888 and 1889 and 1890, when the children were in bed and the work of the day was done, they sat together in the parlor or on the porch and talked and read, and sometimes said nothing for long stretches. And the silence was the good kind, the kind that two people can only share when they have built something real between them, and Roy thought sometimes of the letter, of Mrs. Prewitt's careful honesty, of the 2 words that had stopped him and made him read the whole thing again. He thought about what would have happened if he had not stopped at those words, if he had read them as a warning and set the letter aside. He could not follow that thought to any conclusion because the conclusion was too empty to contemplate. He had been sent for her immediately. He would have done it 10 years earlier if he had known. The decade turned toward 1890, and the Donovan ranch entered a new chapter that was in every way the fruit of what had been built. The cattle operation was established and profitable. The house was full and warm. The children were growing into people of genuine character. Helen had recently completed the 3rd year of her association with the Territorial Education Committee, a body she had been appointed to serve on in 1887 on the strength of her work in Cassidy Creek, and this was a source of both significant additional work and clear satisfaction, because it allowed her to argue for proper schooling across a wider geography, and she argued for it with the full force of her particular eloquence. She had also, in a development that she described to Roy with a composure that he found entirely characteristic and entirely extraordinary, been asked by the territorial newspaper in Santa Fe to contribute a monthly column on education and community life on the frontier. She showed him the letter from the editor, a man named Whitfield, and watched Roy read it with the same expression she had used when watching him read anything important. He put the letter down and looked at her. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said, "you are going to do it." "I believe I am," she said. "Good." He handed her back the letter. "Write what you know more than anyone I have ever met." She took the letter and looked at him, the warm, serious brown eyes, the woman who had come out of a letter, who had climbed down off a stage in a dusty New Mexico town and told him she wanted to see the stove, who had made the ranch a home and the town a better place and his life more complete than he had known a life could be. "I love you," she said, not as a preamble to anything, just as the thing itself. He said it back, and meant it with the whole of his 39 years and the whole of what those years had added up to, and she nodded once, as though this settled something, and went to the writing desk and began. The column ran for the first time in October of 1890, and it was very much what Roy had predicted it would be: clear and direct and honest, and occasionally startling in its precision about things that others preferred to leave fuzzy. And it was read in Cassidy Creek with the kind of attention reserved for things that are good, which is to say that people disagreed with parts of it and agreed with other parts and talked about it on the street and at the general store. And Hargrove said once that he could tell which week the column had run because the conversations in his store had better arguments in them. Helen wrote about the importance of educating girls as rigorously as boys, which was not a universally popular position in 1890 and which she made anyway. She wrote about the need for consistency in territorial schooling standards and the inadequacy of the current funding. She wrote once with great care about the history of the land and the people who had been displaced from it, and this column was the most talked about and the most controversial and the most important thing she had written, and she stood behind it without qualification when people challenged her on it, which some did, and in the way of people who are right about a difficult thing, she was never fully answered by the challenges, only confirmed. Roy read every column before she sent it, not to approve it, because she did not need his approval, but because she asked him to, and he understood that she was asking him to be a reader and an honest one, the kind that would say if something was unclear or if an argument had a gap in it. And he did this as honestly as he could, and sometimes she revised on his note and sometimes she said, "No, I think I had it right," and she was always one or the other and never both at once. This was marriage, Roy thought, not the soft romantic image of it but the real thing, the living thing, the one that required honesty and patience and the willingness to be known and the willingness to know, and it was better than the image in every way that mattered. James turned 9 in October of 1892, serious and bookish and horse-mad, and possessed of a moral seriousness that both his parents recognized, and that Helen said privately was going to either make him a judge or a preacher or a considerable nuisance, depending on how the world went. Maggie turned 7 that same November and showed no signs of moderating the boldness that had characterized her from the beginning, which Helen had long since stopped trying to moderate because it was, as she admitted to Clara Sutton one afternoon, genuinely who the child was, and you could not argue a person out of their own nature without losing the best part of them in the process. It was Maggie who asked Helen one evening at the dinner table why some people could not go to school, a question prompted by something she had overheard and half understood about restrictions on certain families in the territory, and Helen answered her in full and honest terms appropriate to a 7-year-old, which is to say, she did not pretend it was simple, and she did not pretend it was not wrong. And Roy watched his daughter absorb this with the specific focus of a child who is deciding what to do with a piece of information rather than simply where to file it. James said, "Then we should do something about it." "Yes," Helen said, looking at both her children. "We should." Roy looked at his wife across the table, and she looked at him, and there it was again. That thing that lived between them, that had been building since the day she stepped off the stage and named his stove, that had deepened in every year of this life they had built in the red country of New Mexico territory. He thought of her stepping off the stage, travel-dusted and straight-backed, looking at him the way a person looks at something they haven't made their mind up about yet. He thought of her reading the letter he had written to her in the rooming house in St. Louis, deciding in the gray light of a March morning whether to trust the thing one more time. He thought of the day he had kissed her by the red sandstone, and she had said yes, and the wedding in October with Dale making everyone laugh and Mrs. Castillo crying magnificently, and the children's first nights and the hard winters and the storms they had watched together from the porch and all the evenings of all the years. He thought of a letter and 2 words and the particular decision of a moment that had changed everything. She was willful and proud, Mrs. Pruitt had written, without apology. Roy Donovan had read that twice, and he would have read it 100 times more, and sent for her 100 times over, and been grateful every single time that the letter had been honest, and that he had been paying enough attention to recognize what that honesty was telling him. Across the table, Helen reached over and put her hand on his briefly, between clearing the plates, and looked at him with those warm and certain eyes. He turned his hand and held hers. Outside, the New Mexico evening was coming in deep and blue, and the stars were beginning to appear over the mesa, one by one in the darkening sky, as they had every evening since the world began and would continue to do, magnificent and indifferent and beautiful, over the Donovan Ranch and the town of Cassidy Creek and the whole wide turning territory. While inside the kitchen the lamp was lit and the children were talking, and the coffee was on, and the two people who had chosen each other across a letter and a continent sat together in the warmth of everything they had made, and the story that had begun with Willful and Proud was still being written, and it was a very good one.